Sure, but this is not the case. It really happened in front of our eyes, and the question is what should be done in regard to it in order to avoid it in the future. It's going to be a tough struggle. There will be many tough and painful moments along the way, but I believe that if we will coordinate diplomatic, operational, intelligence, and economic activities that will not let them land at any airport and will isolate automatically any nation that is ready to host terror or support them. By doing this consistently along 6 or 10 years, we will reduce dramatically this challenge to all our way of life.
Your words, Mr. Barak, are very similar to the words used to justify missile defense in the United States, which may have taken another 10 or 15 years. Here we've seen low-tech hijacked by those with evil intent.
Yeah, I believe that it's, first of all, missile defense is also something which is clearly needed as long as there are rogue states, and it should be done, and it should be deployed maybe not on national level, but only on trans-regional level to cover exactly the threat from rogue states like Iran, Iraq, or Libya. But in this area, we will suffer. It will not be so easy to go aboard an airplane in the near future, but we have no way but to stand firm facing terror. Otherwise, all our way of life will be threatened. And to stand firm means to isolate from the world every nation that is hosting them and calling every terror thug with the accurate name and be ready with all the pains that come with it to act upon our observations.
What price might democracy have to pay, given what has happened in the last 3 hours in the United States, given what you're experiencing now in Israel, in the center of Jerusalem, from your own citizens now, with the bombing over the weekend?
There is no shortcuts. You know, our civilization is already highly vulnerable. Look at the entrances into the gates of boarding airplanes. It's a situation where it's not easy. Every simple step, crossing borders or going on a plane or on a ship, will become more complicated. But at the same time, it's a time to identify. There are no more than 5 or 6 countries in the world which are directly or indirectly responsible for hosting terror. There are no more than 10 or 15 terror thugs in the world. All the organizations are well known. The MI6 know all the information, the CIA knows, the Mossad knows it, and the same, the Siem Bureau, the band. And it's time for action. Facing such an attack, we cannot but act. And these terror thugs and rogue leaders are highly skillful in identifying the slightest cracks in the wheel of power or power of will of the leaders of the free world.
But let me press this point about democracy and the price democracy may have to pay, because you know very well that many passengers in the United States have long expected to be able to walk into an airport, get on a domestic aircraft unhindered within about 10 minutes of the plane taking off. Yeah. They expect that as a free country.
And it's a part of the problem that we have in a world which is so turbulent that we won't be able to isolate our advanced way of life from what happens around. And it's a time to launch a operational, concrete war against terror, even if it takes certain pains from the routine activities of our normal society.
Now, Mr. Barak, you have deep problems, great attention in the Middle East at the moment, but you've used there a war against this kind of terrorism. What can be done? Because the great thing that is talked about by people like you, diplomats, politicians, world leaders, is preventing conflict before it happens. When you talk about a war, how do you take a war or a challenge or a struggle to those who are determined, through 3 or 4 people only today, to hijack 4 planes at least, as we know, hit the Pentagon, hit the World Trade Center, try and hit, we believe, somewhere else? How do you take a war to 4 people?
I spent decades struggling terror, almost, with my 10 fingers, together with a lot of colleagues all around the world. I believe that the world intelligence community, in a concerted effort, can identify within few months the sources of this terror. They can identify the places where they are deployed on Earth. Every such a place is within certain country. Bin Laden sits in Afghanistan. There is a source of
who else
terror.
Can you identify, though? Because we're not saying he's responsible for this necessarily.
No, we don't say that he's necessarily responsible. We know where other terror thugs are living. We know that Ferganskaya Dolina in Central Asia is a major route for drugs, but at the same time major route for terror. And I know that President Putin is highly committed to the struggle against terror, and I feel that he should be part of this international effort. I believe that the MI6 is highly capable. You have proven it along decades. Your own skills in standing firm politically and acting pointedly, operationally against terror. And we should cooperate with
preemptively?
Both preemptive and by diplomatic means, namely rogue states. There are 5 of them: Iran, Iraq, Libya, North Korea. These kind of states should be treated as rogue states. And the same applies to even to leaders like Arafat. We've heard him just recently condemning this. I praise him for this condemnation, but he personally is responsible for many terror events that happened in the last few years. Same happened in some other capitals in the Middle East.
Former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak speaking to me earlier, just after the incidents in New York and Washington, D.C. Let me just report to you that Israel has closed its airspace for 24 hours. The Air Force in Israel is on a higher state of alert. And also all Israeli El Al planes flying transatlantic to North America were immediately recalled and turned round in the air and brought back to Europe and to Israel. That's an internal national decision by the Israelis, although no one knows who is responsible for what has happened in the last 4 hours. Let's now go live to New York City, where our correspondent Jane Stanley now joins me. Jane, we can see behind you those plumes of smoke still rising from the World Trade Center, what's left of it. Describe the mood and the atmosphere and what you can see there.
Well, as you can see, that is indeed where the World Trade Center was. I think many Americans here, New Yorkers, just cannot believe that when that plume of smoke goes, that landmark will not be there. And of course, the 50,000 people who worked in that building every day, we don't know their fate yet. Up and down behind me, you can see ambulances coming, frequently taking victims, injured. We don't know. There's almost a total news blackout. This part of the city is completely closed. But we do know the hospitals are taking in people with very severe burns and injuries from the debris that fell from around the World Trade Center with the initial planes colliding with the buildings. Of course, the area around the World Trade Center was evacuated when the towers themselves collapsed. But there's very much here a sense of not real panic, but of people wanting to get out of the city if they can. I saw huge streams of people walking uptown as far away as possible, and people coming out of buildings, people just almost totally evacuating the high-rise buildings. The Empire State, for example, nearby was also totally evacuated. So crowds of people on the pavement and wondering what on earth has happened. How can this have happened as well?
Now, Jane, Rudy Giuliani, the mayor, has taken a very tough stand. He's evacuated the whole of the area. What else is coming out of City Hall?
Very little, apart from he is talking of tremendous numbers of casualties, talking in the thousands, because, of course, we have no confirmed death or injured figures. There's actually too much chaos here. For example, the main cellular telephone connections were on top of the World Trade Center, so people can't get through to each other. That's very sad and just horrific for people who are looking for loved ones. I mean, I've seen people crying in the street, desperately bashing their cell phones, trying to get through to family members and trying to see where they are. So it's in this chaos, because of a scale of a tragedy of an attack like this, there is very, very little firm information.
Jane, are you getting a sense really that almost a way of life has begun to seize up in parts of New York City and beyond into the state? Because, of course, many of those working down in Wall Street would have commuted in.
Totally, and this is something that is going to continue and get worse during the day. I mean, for example, Wall Street and the whole financial area and the whole downtown area is closed. Trading has been suspended on the New York Stock Exchange. And I know, because I live further uptown in New York, I'm going to be having to put people up in my apartment tonight because they won't be able to get down there to, it's most likely, to actually go home. People who need to get across the bridges and tunnels, people who would have perhaps been flying home after working here during the day or over the weekend, they can't get anywhere. The airports are closed. It is a city that is sealed in a way in this dreadful event.
And what can one imagine about the way of life? In other words, the basics of life like sanitation, water and so on, because you are talking about an enormous area down there and people who have to service it all.
No, it is a huge area, and you can't imagine how long this is going to take to put together. I mean, 50,000 people alone work in the World Trade Center, or did until today. How many people work in that huge, busy area? Those pavements would have been crowded with people when this accident, this attack happened. So trying to restore the services from this kind of damage is going to be huge. It's going to take a long time for New York to recover physically with its cell phones, its sanitation, like you said, but I think emotionally for New York to recover and for Americans to recover. They're worried about an attack like this, but it never seemed real that something like this could develop and they could watch it happening on their television screens, as is what happened today.
Well, Jane Stanley, thanks for joining us live from South Manhattan. You can see in the background behind Jane there what's left of the World Trade Center, the smoke, the dust, the rubble burning and the dust plume still rising after what happened earlier today. About almost 5 hours ago, it began in New York City, and Fergus Walsh talks us through the sequence of events so far.
It began in Boston when 2 passenger aircraft were hijacked by terrorists. These were United Flight 175 and American Airlines Flight 11, both bound for Los Angeles. They were forced to fly to the World Trade Center in New York. A third plane was hijacked at Washington Dulles Airport. That was American Airlines Flight 77, again bound for Los Angeles. It was flown to the Pentagon in Washington. A fourth aircraft, United Airlines Flight 93, from Newark to San Francisco, crashed southeast of Pittsburgh. Now, the World Trade Center in New York was the 4th tallest building complex in the world, 1,350 feet high. The Twin Towers dominated the skyline of Lower Manhattan. The first impact was just before 9 a.m. New York time, 2 p.m. here. The hijacked aircraft crashed into the 80th floor of the North Tower, each tower being 110 stories high. Now, 8 minutes later, a second plane crashed into the South Tower around the 65th floor. Now, the World Trade Center is the largest commercial complex in the world. It's effectively a mini-city. 50,000 people work inside. It has 90,000 visitors every day. The casualties inside and on the ground are unknown. What we do know is that American and United Airlines say the 4 aircraft involved had a total of 266 passengers and crew on board. Now, within an hour, the Twin Towers had collapsed. Now, unlike most conventional skyscrapers, which have lots of interior columns to give strength to the building, the exterior walls of the World Trade Center bore most of the load, so the direct attacks were enough to weaken the buildings and lead to their collapse. Now, let's turn to Washington. Within 45 minutes of the attacks on the World Trade Center, another hijacked plane had crashed in a direct hit on the Pentagon. One side of the 5-sided building was completely destroyed. Just over 30 minutes later, a car bomb exploded outside the State Department. Again, there's no figure on casualties. American fighters are now patrolling the skies above New York, Washington and other key locations to guard against further attacks. American military and government buildings across the world are on high alert. Other tall buildings in the US, such as the Sears Tower in Chicago, have been evacuated. America's day of horror is still unfolding.
Fergus Walsh with the unfolding events of the last 5 hours. Well, President George W. Bush was in Sarasota in Florida when the incidents began in New York City just before 9 local time. Then he flew north to Louisiana, and when he was there, he stopped at an Air Force base and made these promises to hunt down and punish those responsible for the attacks.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward. And freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the